So in this video, I'm going to focus on the Virginia plan and less so on the New Jersey plan. But I want you to keep in mind, as I said in the last video, the goal here isn't for you to know the Virginia plan really well. I'm talking about the Virginia plan in detail in order to introduce you to some ideas and some concepts that are important in understanding how the House of Representatives and the Senate works and the significance of the Great Compromise. And so it's the concepts that you should be interested in, not the plan itself. So first, in the Virginia plan, what they proposed was their Congress was going to have a bicameral legislature. The bicameral legislature, but the word bicameral, it means sort of, if you break down the Latin, bi and cameral means two chambers. There's a lower house and an upper house, and we have a bicameral legislature at the national level. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate. We have a bicameral legislature in the state legislature in California, the state assembly and the state senate. And there are some states that have a unicameral legislature, meaning they just have one chamber. I believe Nebraska just has one legislative branch, not two. So a bicameral legislature was the plan in the Virginia plan. The lower house was going to be elected through a direct election. And a direct election is a basic concept. You have the voters, right? And let's say you have candidate A, B, and C who are running for office, and the voters get to vote, and whoever gets the most votes, candidate A, B, C, whoever gets the most votes wins. That's what we mean a direct election. The voters are voting directly for the candidates, and the candidate with the most votes wins. Now, in terms of the number of seats that each state would get in the lower house, it was going to be based on something called proportional representation. And this is a concept that you're going to need to know and understand, because we're going to return to this a few times. Now, proportional representation just means that representation in the lower house was going to be based on population. Or in other words, if 20% of the population of the country lived in a particular state, then 20% of the seats in the lower house would go to that particular state. If only 2% of the population lived in a particular state, well, then only 2% of the seats in the lower house would go to that state. So proportional representation is when representation is based on population. Now, you have to ask yourself a question. That kind of arrangement, proportional representation, does that give an advantage to the large states or the small states? Now, hopefully you said the large states, right? Because it does. The larger your population, the more representatives you have, the greater chance that your representatives are going to be able to vote for policies that help your state. Let's move on to the upper house. And that's true all the time in proportional representation. It benefits more populous states. Remember, when I say large states, I'm not talking about the size of the state. I'm talking about the population of the state. The upper house in the Virginia plan was going to be elected through an indirect election as opposed to a direct election. And the way this works is that, and the way it was going to work in the Virginia plan, is that voters would vote for their state legislators. So they would vote for the state legislatures, so the representatives in their state. And then their state legislatures would select their representatives for the upper house. And that's why we call that an indirect election. We're not voting for that. We wouldn't be voting for our representatives directly. We vote for somebody who then votes and selects our representatives. And so the upper house was going to be an indirect election, not a direct election. In terms of representation, though, it was going to be based on proportional representation. It was going to be based on population. So the states with the largest population would have the most representatives in the upper house, and the most representatives in the lower house as well. So who is this going to be a benefit to? Well, this is going to be a benefit to the larger states as well. So you can see the lower house and the upper house, the entire Congress is based on proportional representation, and that benefits the larger states. Now, if you're not sure about this, be sure to ask questions on the discussion board so I can explain it further. But I think, hold on if you don't understand it, because I think there might be something coming up that will help make it make more sense in a moment. The executive branch, according to the Virginia plan, was going to be a plural executive. In other words, what we have is a singular executive. We have one president. The Virginia plan envisioned a plural executive, a group of people, I think it was 5 people, who would make up the executive branch. And when the executive had to make decisions, it would be a vote among those people. That's why we call it a plural executive. Here's the key. The plural executives were going to be selected by Congress, by the upper house and the lower house. Now here's the question. Who does that give the advantage to? The large states or the small states? Keep in mind that the lower house was based on a proportional representation. The upper house was based on proportional representation. And as I said, proportional representation always benefits the large states, because the larger your population, the more representatives you get. And so in the same way that the lower house and the upper house were going to be, the large states were going to have the advantage, since Congress was going to be selecting the executive, they were also going to have an advantage when it came to selecting the executive branch, the plural executives. So maybe it's not a surprise, but the Virginia plan set it up so that when it came to Congress, the large states have the advantage. That when it came to the executive branch, the large states had the advantage. And when it came to the judicial branch, it probably won't surprise you that the large states would always have the advantage as well. The way it was going to work is that the judicial branch, judges were going to be appointed for life, and they were going to be selected by Congress. And Congress was going to be based on proportional representation. And so who would that give the advantage to? Once again, the large states. So going back to our definition of politics, if the Virginia plan had been adopted lock, stock, and barrel, no changes, they said, yeah, let's do the Virginia plan. In the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, my definition of politics, the definition we're going to be working with, who would the winners have been if the Virginia plan had been adopted? The large states. And who would the losers have been? The small states. Now, the New Jersey plan is referred to as the small state plan. Right? The proponents of the New Jersey plan, they didn't want to like just ditch the entire Articles of Confederation. They wanted to amend it. They wanted to make some changes because they realized that the national government wasn't strong enough to address some of the challenges that were happening domestically. But one of the things they wanted to keep was the rule of one state, one vote. In the legislature, under the Articles of Confederation, every state got one vote. Now, a lot of times when students think about this one state, one vote, they'll say, Phil, that seems fair. Every state gets one vote. What's wrong with that? Who does that give an advantage to? Well, here's what I want you to think about. And I'm going to use the numbers from the 2021 census, the most recent census, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. According to the most recent census, right, 2021, there were 39,613,493 people in California. So let's just call it 39 million in California. Now, if you totaled up the population of the 20 least populous states, all 20 of them, the least populous states, their population came to 37,132,386. In other words, California had more people in it than the lowest 20, least populous 20 states. Now, if each state gets one vote, let's say there's a bill that California opposes that small states support. Is one state, one vote fair? Is that democratic? Does that benefit everybody equally because each state gets one vote? No, not at all. When it's one state, one vote, the least populous states have a greater input than the most populous states. And so if the New Jersey plan had been adopted, in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, the winners would have been the small states and the losers would have been the large states because they would have been outvoted by the smaller states. Now, as it worked out, neither one of these plans were adopted. Neither the large states nor the small states would go along with either one of these plans, right? Large states would love the Virginia plan. There's no way the small states would go for it. The small states would have loved the New Jersey plan. There's no way the large states would have gone for it. And so they had to come up with a compromise. We call it the Great Compromise. And I'm going to end on this note. There's a reason that they call it a Great Compromise. And actually, it's pretty simple to understand. They call it the Great Compromise because it was a great compromise. And I'll discuss that more in the next video.